Welcome, everyone. Hello, hello. I'm so happy to be here. Welcome to today's Tubman Talk. I'm Dr. Bianca Beauchemin, and I am an assistant professor in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and I'm also a member of the executive committee here at the Tubman Institute and the coordinator of the Tubman Talk. So Tubman Talks is a space and a platform to share research and publication with audiences who are doing work related to or interested in African and African diaspora. And sorry, I'm not in shape anymore, y'all. I went up those stairs really quickly. So the Tubman community, which I'm happy to see many of you here today, is interdisciplinary and welcomes a wide range of topics and backgrounds. Tubman Talks are intended to provide an opportunity for individual scholars to critically strengthen their own research by presenting it to others in the spirit of engaging in debate. So before we begin and I introduce our speaker today, I did want to take the time to make a land acknowledgement. I wanted to acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and this territory is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. In making this land acknowledgement, I honor and acknowledge the lands and its people who have been here for thousands of years. In relation, I would be remiss to not mention the current war, genocide happening in Gaza. And while we mourn all the lives lost in Israel and Palestine, it's important to contextualize the repressive colonial and imperial oppression that undergird the current situation. Influenced by Black feminist politics, scholarship, praxis, and movement, I recognize that my political commitments, mandates, and solidarity are bound up and intertwined with the liberation, self-determination of Indigenous people, Palestinian people, Vietnamese people, Congolese people, Haitian people. So just trying to highlight the different ways in which our politics are constantly intertwined. So with no further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Ife's talk today called Gender Power Through Spirituality, the Case of Igbo West Africa. So mainstreaming the mystics, it's a little abstract to get you a little into it. Mainstreaming the mystic traces the utility and recovery of traditional modes of gendered spirituality in southeastern Igbo communities. It explores how contemporary Igbo women adjust to the simultaneous practices of traditional Igbo spirituality, Odinani and Christianity without conflict. This presentation also investigates the connections between the colonial encroachment of Igbo West African communities and the subsequent and sustained decline of the status of Igbo women. It plots these connections by interrogating how unique modes of power, specifically spiritual power, utilized by Igbo women were subsequently diminished through a three-pronged approach of colonization, Western religion, and Western education. Ultimately, this work problematized the binary and rigid interpretation of Igbo culture as patriarchal, abusive to women, masculinistic, and women-hating by contextualizing the meaning and application of power, particularly gendered, through spirituality. It posits that power exists in the quiet, the mysterious, the taken for granted, the hidden, the unorthodox, and the unexplained. And of course, this beautiful talk will be given by Ife Winwa. Oh, yeah, did I do it? No. Ife, I want to say it right. Ife Win, did you try? Yeah, yeah. Can you give me it? Ife what? Ife what?
Let's just go with that.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll talk.
Okadigbo, widely known as Ife, is a dedicated PhD candidate within the esteemed School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies here at York University. Her academic journey has been characterized by a profound commitment to unveiling the multifaceted dimension of gender, coloniality, and African feminism. Ify holds an impressive academic record, boasting 2 master's degrees in gender and international development from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom, and in gender, feminist, and women's studies from York University. Her research endeavors are anchored in a decolonial feminist perspective, reflecting her fervent desire to critically examine the ramification of the colonial encounter and its enduring legacy on the lives, aspiration, and future trajectories of African women in the Igbo and Hausa communities of Nigeria. The scholarship pursuits encompasses a rich tapestry of subjects with a primary focus on coloniality, decolonization, African feminism, African personhood, traditional women's movement, and gendered relationships. Her multidisciplinary approach to complex issues in the realm of gendered power and its connection to spirituality promises to contribute significantly to the evolving discourse in these fields, ultimately paving the way for a more inclusive and equitable future. Everybody, please help me in giving Ify a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca, for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much for everyone that's. Thank you so much for everyone for being here and for attending my presentation today. The title of my presentation is Gender Poetry Spirituality, the case of Igbo West African. We can go ahead and to the next slide. We can talk about what to expect in these presentations. So this is a quick slide, just kind of showing what to expect in the presentation. I'm going to be starting with my why, like why am I doing this research, why is this research important, and the why will also have, this talks about the background of my research, so just to provide some context to understand not just the location, but also the ideologies behind the background of my research. I'll talk about my rationale, which is incredibly linked to my why. We'll also talk about my how, so how did I do this research, which will have discourses about my methods, my research methodology, and some specifics about some things that I encountered doing field work that I think are really important that I would like to discuss. And then I'll end the presentation talking about some of my findings, particularly the findings that I thought were the most interesting, or the findings that I thought would kind of provide us with many things to kind of talk about, right? And have the most engagement. So before I go ahead and start talking about what my research is about, I want to very quickly kind of locate myself in this research because it's really important. And locating myself in this research is important because I'm doing a particular type of research. I'm doing research in my community, so I'm doing research with my people. And I'm doing research in communities that have been historically researched in a very particular way, in a very kind of extracted way. So I think it's really important that I explain how my functionality as an insider, outsider in those spaces is really, and it's really important in the way that I chose to do my research. And it's really important in the way I was able to engage in the field, and I was able to encounter all kinds of very complex and not complex things in the field. So other things about my personality that I would like to indicate is that I'm doing, like I said, I'm doing research in my community. I am doing research as a native speaker of the Igbo language. My parents are Igbo. I grew up in an Igbo household. I grew up in a household where that was kind of like the language of communication. I'm an Igbo woman. I'm an Igbo mother. I'm married to an Igbo man, and all these things kind of did play a role while I was doing my research, surprisingly. Selfishly, I do this work for myself, and I do that. I don't know if people else will do that, but I do this work for myself. But I also do this work for Igbo women in particular. So that as well as a kind of played a role now, and I'll explain why. Like I mentioned earlier, this position of this insider outsider did come into play quite to an extent while I was doing my research. And then lastly, and most importantly, I think I'm fascinated with the concept ideology of power, because, and not just power, I think specifically gendered power, because of the many nuanced, complicated ways in which women have power that are not powerful, right? Some of those ways are hard to measure, they're hard to identify. You can't really put those ways, the ways that women are powerful in like an easy, right? pie chart. They're very complex, they're very nuanced, and so conversations about power always end up being seen in very particular, rigid UN development type, UN type conversations. And so because of that, I find power to be incredibly fascinating. So the next slide, I just want to quickly, very quickly talk about kind of like the geographical location of what I'm talking about. Now, the Igbo people are the third largest ethnic group in Nigeria. They're about, kind of depends on which, article you're reading. You hear that they're either 35 million or 40 million. So it's kind of hard to say. And there's many reasons why this number is different. And they're mostly political, right? Those numbers tend to fluctuate. So I'm going to go with 35 million because that's the and the Igbos have many fascinating qualities. Contemporary Igbo people are kind of known as being very entrepreneurial. They love to travel. You can find them everywhere all over the world. They are very industrious people. And most Igbos are found in the southern eastern region of Nigeria. You find a few Igbos in Cameroon and in Cameroon mostly, but the predominant number of Igbos are found in Nigeria, in the southwest part of Nigeria. However, there are two kinds of Igbos, right? There are two locations in Nigeria where you can find Igbos. And Igbo is the language that they speak. It's not just any of their culture. You're either going to find Igbos in the southeastern region of Nigeria, or you find Igbos in the south region of Nigeria. So the Igbos in the southeast are Igbos like me. Where the people say that we're the real Igbos. But we are the most, we are the Igbos that are the most easily identifiable Igbos. Let's put it that way. That sounds problematic, but let's just put it that way for now. You can talk about that later. And then the Igbos in the south region are, they have several ways in which they're kind of described. They're either called Delta Igbo because they're from the Delta region of Nigeria. They're called Ika Igbos, another way to describe, but they're more significantly called Anioma. They're called Anioma too. And they also speak Igbo, but they speak a different variant of Igbo, but most Igbos will understand them. It was really important that I did my research kind of highlighting the southern eastern Igbos. That's the map of the southern eastern Igbos. And this map is, this map is for the Anioma Igbos because I didn't want to just do research where I'm only speaking to one group of Igbos. I wanted to speak to many groups because I wanted to see if there was any kind of conflict in the way gender spirituality was seen in some locations as opposed to others. So that's kind of why I sort of highlighted that. Now, the background of my research. So this quote by Wandu Achebe pretty much sums up a lot of the background of my research. My research significantly, what my research is significantly about is power, like I've mentioned, but not just power, just vaguely. It's significantly about gendered power, right? So, so my research does several things. The first thing that it does is it documents the ways in which gendered power existed in pre-colonial society. And when I say pre-colonial society, I mean before the encroachment of colonization, particularly Christianity. Now, why Christianity is sort of the case in point here is because in many Igbo communities, Christianity is kind of the most visible religion, Abrahamic religion. And not to say that there isn't Islam, but majority of Igbos are Christians, right? So that's the first thing it does. It kind of documents what existed before Christianity, how spirituality was performed, particularly by women. The second thing that my research does is that it tries to investigate how some of those practices have sustained or diminished. And for the ones that have sustained, how has it sustained? In what ways are these forms of spirituality still practiced today? Is it now a confirmation or not? Is it completely modified? Is it completely changed? Is it completely different from what it was before? And in what ways has it, and in what ways is it now taken up? In what ways is it accepted or rejected? So that's kind of the second thing that my work does. Ultimately, what my work seeks to do, and I think Bianca kind of mentioned that kind of talking about bio, is that it tries to show how power must be understood beyond the way that it's understood today. That power must be understood more robustly, that there must be more nuance in the way power is kind of described. That there must be more nuance in the way we aspire to be powerful, right? That conversations about power has to include so many other elements that don't exist today about, especially for women, right? That's what my work also seeks to do, right? When I was kind of heading to the beat, that was the plan that I had in my mind. Other things about the background of my research that I really need to talk about, because I need to talk about this idea of spirituality. In pre-colonial Igbo setting, back up a bit. Spirituality in Igbo culture and Igbo culture are incredibly intertwined. There's no divorcing culture and spirituality. They're exactly the same thing. So spirituality is not something you do on Monday and then you do your culture on Tuesday. It's not doesn't have that kind of very, it doesn't exist, they're all the same. And spirituality for me is a way in which we can have conversations about power, right? Because in many of these communities before Christianity, there was this, again, Christianity was not the practice. So it was different forms of spirituality that women in particular were able to use that kind of set them apart. It gave them a different kind of status. It put them in a different category from the men, from other people in society. So that's predominantly what my background was. Looking at the practices, understanding how those practices are somehow connected with the way power is negotiated, with how power could be accessed, with how power could be constructed in very tangible ways. So I'm not talking about spirituality like this very loosey-goosey, hocus-pocus type thing, but how power can be incredibly tangible and how those forms of spiritual power were able to kind of give women more material power, so more tangible power, it's economic or other kinds of power. So that's, I just wanted to add that point about spirituality. So my why, doesn't get more obvious than this. The first thing about the why I do this work is all the basis colonial propaganda that people culture is that people's spirituality is diabolic, that it's barbaric, that it's evil. That's very intrinsic to my work. And like I mentioned earlier in the last slide, culture and spirituality in Igbo society are part of the same thing. So if I'm going to be critiquing, for example, Christianity, for example, there's no way that I could do that critique without really talking about how Christianity has kind of positioned how spirituality as diabolic. There's no way to avoid that. My research also kind of exposes how the abandonment of Igbo women and their connections to their ancestors has kind of, and I put real life in air quotes for a reason, real life impact in their place in society and their overall well-being in contemporary Igbo society. So that's another thing that my work does, to show how the abandonment of certain spiritual practices, the abandonment of certain cultures, has also kind of created this kind of, I don't want to say identity crisis, but I'll say identity crisis. But there's been some kind of sort of displacement for people, just not going about the world, not really understanding who they are. And I put this in bold because this is really important, central to my work. The last point here that my work about gender power exists in the quiet, in the mysterious, and taken for granted, the hidden. Again, particularly gender power. There are many ways to be powerful, right? There's just many ways in which women are able to hold power. Conversations about empowerment are just too limited and too rigid. So this is my why. This is kind of why I do this work. Central to my work, which is also kind of connected to my why, is fundamentally this is kind of what I believe, right? It challenges, so my work challenges the Western/dominant conceptualization of power, especially gender power, and we think that power is not limited to the affairs of domination, violence, erasure, accumulation, theft, and subjugation. And I need to explain, like, whenever we're talking about, whenever there's discourses about power, there's always this emphasis on sort of the material. Especially in Africa, when we talk about, I say Africa in general, when we talk about what it means for women to be powerful, it's always in two ways. We're talking about political participation for women, and we're talking about economic empowerment for women entrepreneurship, boss type thing, completely forgetting that it's not enough for you to have a seat in parliament. Like that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be powerful. Not that that's not important, it is important, but it's just not it's not enough. There's just so much else to being powerful. And the last point that I make here about power is not limited to the appearance of domination, right? Again, I don't agree with Trump. I'm sorry, I just have to mention people. Like many of the conversations that you hear people mention about why Trump. I'm so sorry for bringing Trump. I do have to apologize again. But somehow he's here. So I'm just going to make one sentence about Trump, and that would be the end. Conversations about why Trump's going to be such a great leader of this power. He has this this appeal. He seems to be powerful because he's quite brash. He knows how to make the deals and get the best deals from the US and stuff like that. So in those ways, power is constructed through this idea of dominance, powerful, and right. I don't even want to talk about theft. We're in North America. You know how that happened. I don't even want to talk about violence because we live in Takaranto. We know all of us our subjugation, right? So central to my work is that in talking about power, we must divorce this notion. This is not what it means to be powerful. Like this is not what we should be celebrating as powerful. And I know that may seem very idealistic, but that's pretty much what is central to my work. That this is not what we should be celebrating. Being powerful has to have a lot more humanity in what it is. So very quickly, I'm going to talk about my methodology, but very quickly because I really want to talk about my findings. So that's, I think, where the interesting part is. So my work kind of employs a critical, actually, decolonial feminist perspective is kind of what my work. That's my research methodology, and why a critical decolonial feminist approach I use this kind of methodology is for several reasons, right? There are many things about a decolonial feminist perspective that works really well with the kind of research that I do. It centers the voices of the margins. It prioritizes the retelling of history from the women or a feminine perspective. It completely divorces itself from this masculinist emphasis, the way history is told. There's so many things about the decolonial feminist perspective that I absolutely love. I wanted to touch real quick on this first point here, that it's quite diverse, right? So it uses several techniques, right? Whether it's imagination, people that I've read in Number, talking about this, imagining a new Africa. He talks about this in a lot of his poetry. He talks about this imagining of a different kind of Africa that is very conscious, that is very embracing of its culture and its roots, or other people that use decolonization quite a lot in their work. They're not described as decolonial activists. You have Fanon, which hopefully most of us have read, talks a lot about revolution, creating a new world, pulling down existing structures, burning down everything and creating completely new structures. And then we have our very own Professor Mianda that uses education to kind of tackle decolonization. So not just decolonizing the curriculum, but decolonizing our consciousness, decolonizing academic institutions, decolonizing knowledges, what it means to be knowledgeable, what it means to have intellect, who's allowed to have intellect, different things like that. So there's several people that do this work of decolonization, and they do it in very different ways. Like I was saying before, the last point here that I make is that it places considerable emphasis on centering the voices from the margins, particularly African women, and by critiquing the androcentric and misogynistic character of modernity. So central to decolonial framework is critiquing modernity, right? Insisting that the ways in which the world has been structured, where there's this emphasis to modernize or globalize, that it has several contentions with the way we have to live our lives. Talked about how it's, it foregrounds the gendered implication of colonization on culture, on knowledge, on education, economics, sexuality, religion, social, economic, and political structures, law, health, law, and it really does, it kind of wants you to step back, but not entirely, step back completely, and to kind of provide a completely different reading of our history and our culture in a way that doesn't center the perspective of a colonizer. Right. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a few things that I experienced while I was doing field work. While we do work and after field work. And I will just touch on a few things that I feel are the most noteworthy. But before I do that, I wanted to very quickly identify some of my own personal strategies of how I choose to kind of decolonize my own research. So there are several things that I do, like decolonization absolutely centers the voices of the margins, like I said. And how did I do that in my research? So several ways. I didn't set out while I was doing my interviews to speak to certain types of people. Like I wasn't looking for, there wasn't any kind of, I didn't set out wanting to talk to particular types of people in certain status. I wasn't looking for like college professors. I did speak to one college professor, but it was completely unintentional. But I didn't set out to only interview certain people of certain class or educational level or anything like that. So that was one thing. I wanted to speak to anyone and everyone that would speak to me. I didn't care what level of education or any of that. That didn't mean anything to me. The other way in which I'm very practical in decolonizing my work, by decolonizing bibliography, I got this tip from my supervisor, Dr. Harriet, when I was doing my MA 4 years ago. She kind of mentioned something in passing about decolonizing your bibliography, and kind of what that means is deciding that most of the people that you reference will be people from the margins, people from the global south. For me, in particular, authors from Africa, that was very specific to me, but not just authors from Africa, but women, right? Women from Africa that are authors that don't have their work published in this fancy Western journals. That was kind of my emphasis to happen in my bibliography. In my MA, I think I was able to kind of have like 80% of my bibliography. I was really proud of myself. Now in writing my my dissertation, I don't have as much as 80%. I keep going back and swapping people out. So the goal is to be at 80%. I don't really think I'm going to make it, but I still have that same strategy whereby I'm sort of figuring out a way to have at least 80% of the people that I reference, that I cite, as people from the global south, but particularly women from the global south. Now, other things like decolonizing the language of research was also very instrumental in many of my decolonial practices. So one thing that in my research, I don't use the word, what are they called? Research respondents. Respondents, and there's another one.
Interlocutors?
Participants. I don't use participants, and respondents sounds terrible, like people just responding.
Yeah.
So I don't use respondents or participants because it just sounds odd. So I use co-producers in my work because I would not have this work without them. Like if you think about that, I wouldn't have any findings or data, whatever, if not for these people, right? And the idea of co-producers for me, I think the first time I ever considered that was in reading Patty Collins, and she was talking about how Black women are legitimate, I use that in their quotes, it's all Black women legitimate. They're legitimate like knowledge producers, and they have I feel like people know this better than me, but something about how Black women are able to theorize and how their lives and their lived experiences are worthy of theory, and how they don't have to have this fancy, sounding whatever to be able to contribute to scholarship, to be able to contribute to theory. And I thought, this is wonderful. This makes perfect sense. And thinking about decolonization, how going into the field with that kind of epistemic humility I would not have any of this. I would not be doing this presentation, but for the people that have decided to speak to me and have been generous with their time and with their resources and have chosen to be vulnerable, because I'm asking them, I was asking quite personal questions and people decided to, they felt comfortable enough to share this personal stories with me. Right? I can't call them respondents, like I just think disrespectful. So other things as well, when if it's in conversations about language, speaking your native language when you're doing the research, which I did, most of my interviews were done in Igbo language. Again, to also kind of know that it's entirely possible to remove that hierarchy. And I'll talk about hierarchies later because it wasn't always, there were times when I had some hierarchy over the people I was speaking to, and there were times where I had absolutely no hierarchy. So it wasn't always the same. But I found that speaking the native language provided, sort of reduced that kind of, you know, interviewee kind of vibe. Other things as well about decolonizing knowledge, what kind of knowledges did I collect? What did I think was good enough to be my dissertation? What kind of, how did I categorize the sort of knowledges and the stories that I field? Were also other ways in which I would identify as me being very conscientious about decolonizing my research. Now, okay, so we're going to go into the findings. This portion of the presentation will be talking about how so this word is Odinani, and that is the Igbo name for Igbo spirituality, right? So I wanted, like I said, the second thing that my work does is kind of document how it shows up today. So I wanted to kind of see how spirituality is being performed today. Is it being performed in what way, in what kind of context? That was a huge part. And now this lady here is, they are called Omu. So Omu is queen in Igbo language. And she is an Omu of a community in the south region of Nigeria. The name of the community is called Isemgu. So she's the queen of that community. And this is her in the market. Trying really hard not to smile. So my findings. Okay, I feel like there was a slide that I skipped, which is fine. If you wanted me to talk more specifically about my voice is really loud.
No, it's beautiful.
You should be.
Gonna mess with my aesthetic.
You just put it under, like, on your pants. Okay. Yeah, you don't put it behind your.
Okay, so there was a slide that I kind of skipped, unfortunately. It was a slide talking about my fieldwork experience and things the challenges. I can talk about that later if there's time. If people want to hear my experiences, that's fine, but I'll just go ahead and just continue. So my findings. Okay, so I have to back up a little bit. When I was sort of traveling to Nigeria and I wanted to do these interviews, most of what I wanted to investigate was the spiritual practices that existed and how it exists today. Like that was kind of my goal. I wanted to see what that looked like and how the spiritual practices somehow translated to power, to sort of giving women access to power. That was the plan. But I found that I was able to kind of document to some degree how Igbo spirituality exists today, but it didn't quite. There were many surprises about the way in which it exists today that I was completely blindsided. I didn't expect that those would be the ways in which it exists today. So the broad themes from my interviews with my co-producers are divided into this 6 big, large subheadings. The first subheading here is the construction of Igbo gendered power through spirituality. So this is very broad. This is kind of how it existed in the past, and in some ways still today.
It also identifies some practices that that women see perform today in Igbo society that are not just to access power, but in so many other interesting ways that I will talk about later. The second point here is called dualistic fluidity. And I had to kind of come up with a concept to explain how Igbo spirituality is practiced today. And the only way that it could be explained or understood is through this concept that I kind of coined as dualistic fluidity. And I'll explain exactly what that means because I just couldn't find any other way of describing it. The third point here is the loss of spiritual connection. So many of the conversations I had explained how the loss of spiritual connections and the implication that has. The fourth point here I have is colonial denial. And people don't like this. People feel a little bit uncomfortable about this, but I completely stand by that term with my full chest because there is no other way to describe how some of my conversations happen. It was colonial denial. Like I wish I had something nicer. It sounded nicer, but it is what it is. The fifth point here is Odinani tainted by capitalism. And the sixth point here is Odinani masking as Christianity. Now, I will be touching on the 4 points here as well. The next slide will kind of describe the construction of Igbo gender spirituality. I'll have some slides to talk about dualistic fluidity. I'll have slides to talk about the loss of spiritual connections and colonial denial. So this slide here talks about how medicine was used and is still used as a form of power, as a form of gendered power. And my co-producer here that I was speaking to was talking about how in the past, infertility problems with, were almost completely handled by women. He was making this comparison with the fact that now people don't even care to know how to use herbs and different things. They just go straight to the fertility doctor and doing IVF and spending all this money. While there are different ways in which our ancestors were able to kind of deal with that. They had different herbs, they had different things that they would do, and they were quite successful in if you're looking for a baby, there were different ways we used to look for a baby. And this the way that it is in society now where a woman doesn't get pregnant right away is seen as an entirely physical thing that in the past it wasn't. There were several things you had to do to kind of make your body ready for a baby or kind of call a baby to want to sort of be in your womb. That sounded very inappropriate. But that was kind of a way in which women were able to access power. So I know some people will be wondering, how did this make women powerful? It made them powerful because they were the custodians of culture in many respects. It also made them powerful because if people had like very difficult health issues, they knew that they could go to women and women would have a solution that was, they had the solution, they had that knowledge somehow. And that gave them a different status, that gave them power, that set them aside, right, from everybody else in society. So that was one way in which women were seen as powerful. The other ways in which women were seen as powerful is through what many of my co-producers described as their essence. I don't have another word for that, but their essence, through their blood, through their pronouncements. These were other ways in which women were seen as powerful. Now, the argument for the blood of a woman is mostly kind of constructed through menstruation, right? And from this quote here by one of my co-producers, she talks about the fact that when a woman sees a charm when she's menstruating, that charm is gone, signifies a great sense of power. So Igbo women have power embedded within them. The blood of a woman is powerful. Did you know that when a woman is menstruating and makes love to a man, she has killed his spirituality? So you can only imagine the follow-up questions that came with that, because I was so, not only did I want to know how one can kill a person's spirituality by lovemaking, I was even more interested in this idea of blood being powerful, because in many readings, when they talk about African women and having power through menstruation, blah, 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 it's not described as powerful, right? Because the idea is when a woman is menstruating, she's kind of domesticated. You know, you leave her at home and she doesn't really do anything, and she's not a part of anything. She doesn't go to work, blah, blah, blah. So I was kind of struggling with this idea that somehow that sort of meant that she's powerful if she can't even go to work and she's sort of stuck at home. And the understanding that I you know, well, still on the fence, but the understanding was that because when a woman is menstruating, she has so much power in that period of the month that she could be dangerous. So she had to be, I don't want to say confined, because that's not the point. You know, I'm not trying to say she was confined, but she couldn't just be like going wherever willy-nilly. And I thought, is that powerful if she couldn't go wherever willy-nilly? And they're like, yeah, the only reason why you think that's not powerful is because you don't have an understanding of how powerful a woman is at that time of the month. That it makes more sense for her to not be around so much, right? And just kind of take it easy and stay home and just protect everybody else from how dangerous she is when she's menstruating. Another point about this idea of blood was also kind of constructed through conversations about in our current world, you know, we talk about women PMSing and stuff like that. So the understanding was that women needed to rest while they were menstruating. That that in that period of the month, it was in their best interest to be at home and have comfort and rest. And there were several other things in that period of the month where, you know, you could do to take care of yourself, whether it's baths, whether it's herbs that would help with the pain, whether it's things that would help with your mood. And so it didn't mean that because women had to kind of take things a little slower when they were menstruating, that it doesn't mean that that was a way of people taking their power away. That was just kind of how it made sense, right? At this time of the month, you have to be careful with your associations because you have immense power at this time. That was kind of how it was understood. The next slide that I'm going to share also talks about power. It also talks about power, gender power, particularly through the naked body of a mother. So I really battled about putting this picture. I don't think I need to explain why, but it was one of those, should I not type of things. And I decided that I would. I'm going to back up quite a lot now and explain how nakedness is seen as powerful. Now, in Igbo culture, the nakedness of a female mother is seen as immensely powerful for many reasons. Because a mother would never just choose to move around the world naked, right? So for a mother to decide to be naked, it had this it came with this immense connection with her spirituality and with power. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it, the second aspect of nakedness is also seen through discourses of performing masculinities, right? So there are several authors that talk about the way in which African women, Igbo women in particular at this point, the way they're able to access power is by somehow being masculine, right? That somehow there has to be some performance of masculinity to some degree for you to attain power. Now, in Igbo culture, for many people, for many authors, many scholars, they describe power in Igbo culture as having a masculine gender, right? That's kind of, it has a masculine gender. That's how it's understood overall. You can always critique that, you can problematize it, but overall it's seen as having a masculine gender. Now, the woman in this picture is an Omu. We saw her before. She was pretending, she's struggling, like she didn't want to smile. Now, the Omus are queens, like I said before, and for you to become a queen or an Omu, you had to transform from a woman to a man. There has to be some transformation happening. You now become a man, right? And some of the ways in which you become a man is by your physical appearance. So cut your hair really low, you don't have long flowy hair. And other ways will be the way that you present yourself. So you wouldn't tie your wrapper in your waist. You know, men tie their wrapper in their waist. So you would tie your wrapper in your waist, instead of putting it up in your chest, because you're trying to say that you have now been transformed to a man, right? So this picture of Omu was her way of telling me that oh, she's now a man. Like, you're embarrassed for me, but I'm a man. I can have my wrapper on my chest, and I'm like, oh my God. I'm just like, it's problematic ethics, right? Because to her she had transformed into a man. She's a man, so she doesn't have to put her. She lives very different particularities and stuff like that. So, I have 5 minutes. Okay. This quote talks about the female body and how it's incredibly powerful, and I think it was what's her name? There's a very old reading about women's movements. I think her name is Van Allen, and she talks about sitting on a man. It's a thing in Igbo culture, where if there's men are sort of not behaving properly or different things, women show up in the house of a man, and they go there without their clothes, and they make fun of him. And we talked about this, Kelston, in the last how they show up in the man's house, and they make fun of him, they make funny songs about him, and talk about it. Can be very crude, but that was another way. And for Ngozi that I spoke to, that sort of provided this quote, it's not just in the physical, but there was something else happening spiritually, where their naked bodies had such immense power for them to be able to change the actions of people. So I've talked about female nakedness through the Omu, and I've sort of talked about that as well. I've talked about pronouncements, in which just the pronouncements of women had so much power. People didn't want, you could say, I don't mind if a man curses me, but not a woman, and how that has some power, and there's some context behind that, just seeing as just having a lot more weight. Okay, I'm gonna rush. I talked about the Omu. This is one of the Omus that I also spoke to, and how being an Omu is a site of power. Majority of the roles of an Omu are completely spiritual. Most of what she does has spiritual component. Praying for the community, praying for the realm. She does all kinds of sacrifices to make sure that things are good, the children in the community are well. If there's any sickness, she goes and makes consultations to find out what's going on and what they can do to kind of make things right. This is me. I put this picture for a reason, trust me. She was praying for me, and she was so close to me. And for a minute, I had this, and I had to ask myself, why did I feel that? I just felt like, oh, I felt this weird breeze. And I'm like, why did I feel that? Like, am I bringing my own biases to this research? And so I remember this moment so well, because I had this moment where I was like, oh my God. And I'm like, why did I have that oh my God feeling? Now, I absolutely have to talk about dualistic fluidity, and I know I have 5 minutes, probably 2 minutes now, but it's so foundational to my work. Many of the ways in which the practice of Christianity and Igbo spirituality showed up was through this idea of a dualistic fluidity. Now, this quote sort of summarizes it quite brilliantly. I don't have a problem with Jesus, but I still practice Odinani on the side. When I am in the village, I join my family in all traditional events. And when I'm in the city, I'm a member of Mountain of Fires. Mountain of Fires is a really big church in Nigeria. Pentecostal, very popular. It makes sense to me. The fact that I am practicing both is not odd. It is the way that makes sense to me. There are many Igbo women that practice both religions at the time. So I'm going to say what dualistic fluidity is real quick. It is the practice of both Odinani and Christianity simultaneously without conflict. So what that looks like for women is, while they're reading their Bible, they're using several traditional instruments at the same time. What it means for them is they have certain herbs growing in their garden that they use to perform certain kind of spiritual practices, and then they go to church on Sunday. And they don't see any conflict. There's no guilt. There's no, oh, I can't do this because I'm a Christian. I found it so, at the beginning, I found it quite mind-numbing. I'm like, I think I'm telling you the truth. But I eventually realized that, yes, this is how they practice both of those religions. This is just how it makes sense to them. I had a few people give me tips on how I could do it. Like, you can do this, you read your Psalms and Proverbs like this, and then you do this. I'm like, this is incredibly fascinating. And there was no way before I went to do fieldwork that I would have expected that. I just thought that people would practice Christianity, and then some people would practice this, and somehow, Now, while I was doing my interviews, in the moment while I was doing my interviews, it seemed like it was a kind of duality. That was what I thought. I thought it's a kind of duality. Yeah, I can see how they're doing both. But by the time I got back home, Canada, and I was listening to the interviews, I was like, oh, this is not a duality, right? Because a duality, for a duality, there's no slippage, right? It is, you're either a Christian, you do the Christian this, and then you go ahead and you practice Odinani, and there's no interaction. No, it's not a duality. Also, I was completely wrong because I did my presentation in Congress. I was like, oh, it's a duality. I'm like, damn, that was completely wrong. So I'm like, is it fluidity? I can't because it's not, it doesn't have some components of fluidity. Like there's no tolerance. It's not like this loosey-goosey thing. It really isn't. So it's not fluidity. So what could it be? So it has to be some kind of dualistic fluidity. That's kind of how I came to that moment. Because it is dualistic because it's either Odinani or Christianity. Those are the two components. There's nothing in the middle. I didn't find anything in the middle. And then it's fluid in the sense that it allows for this slippage, this meshing between the two. So it has to be some kind of dualistic fluidity. So that's kind of, ignore that. So that's kind of how I came to this moment that there is some kind of intermingling at the same time, right? And one of the omu, another omu that I spoke to, this omu is, you see the word obi there? Obi means king. This omu is a king and a queen. In that community, a woman can be a king and a queen, but it's not in every community. Some communities have that kind of setup. I'm a Christian by birth and I'm a traditionalist by choice. As I continue to advance in life, I've come to understand that life is complicated and things are not always as they seem. If our traditions are so bad and diabolical, why did the white man come here and steal all our deities and put it in their museum? Why are they still learning about our religion? If white people are curious about these things, that means that there is something there, right? So I put it short here deliberately because at the end of every interview, the people, the co-producers that I speak to, especially the queens, they usually pray for me. They say a prayer for me. And this lady had identified to me that she hasn't been to church eons. When she used to go to church, she felt uncomfortable. She doesn't go to church. And then she ends her prayer and says, in Jesus' name. And I'm kneeling down and she's praying and I go, I'm so stunned by that. But I want to say something, but I absolutely don't. I don't want to mess up the vibe. Everything's going well because I'm like, did I hear that correctly? But it just, again, it shows how there's just slippage. Like there's no divorcing one from the other. This is, I promised my last slide, I have to talk about colonial denial. Many of my younger co-producers had what I can only describe as colonial denial. I know it doesn't sound the best, but it is what it is. Questions about, did colonization really happen? Was it that bad? Christianity has saved us, or else we'd be cavemen and women just killing each other. Things like that were quite profound in many of the younger people that I spoke to. And this first quote, which is where I'm going to stop, my co-producer, Adele, said, colonization did not affect the practice of our old religions. My grandmother was a traditional worshiper until 2 years before her death, and she was already in her 80s. And my follow-up question was, why did she convert so late in life? And the answer that I got was, she was under so much pressure. I'm like, why was she under so much pressure? Oh yeah, the family, they didn't like the practice. I'm like, do you see some connections between, was that pressure somehow because of the insistence that people must have a particular kind of religion for you to be a good person? The connection wasn't quite, it wasn't happening. The other quote, I said that was going to be my last quote. I apologize. It's going to be my last quote. The other last quote here talks about that people are still practicing Ominani. Ominani is a variant of Odinani. They're just different, but they got a variant, and they're still doing it. Christianity is not stopping them. My elder sister is a practitioner, and that is all she does. She does not mix it with Christianity like other people. Again, I was like, are you sure that? I apologize. I was like, are you sure that there is no pressure? We talked about societal pressure, but people weren't making the connection between societal pressure and the fact of the colonial encroachment. People weren't making that. Some people weren't making that connection. Just kind of looked at it like, there's just pressure whatsoever. But people weren't making those kind of connections that there is societal pressure because of colonization, because of Christianity, right? And so the only way that I can describe the fact that people weren't making that connection is because there's just this denial or a lack of acceptance of effect the all-encompassing nature of colonization and its many multiple afterlives. Before I go, it says thought. It says thought. I'm going to put this last slide because whenever I'm talking about decolonization, if it can even happen, I might just be idealistic. I always put this quote by Grossvogel, did my best, and he talks about, and we can all read that, so Bianca doesn't kill me with her stares. But this idea of how practical is decolonization? Like if we're saying that we want to advance, we want to globalize, we want to move forward in the world, like, and is this a thing? Is it possible to achieve decolonization? Is it possible to decolonize while advancing? Is it possible to take a step back and be looking and tinkering around about our history while we're supposed to be, you know, moving ahead with the rest of the world and conquering territories and putting our stamp in the world? So I'm going to leave this here for thoughts. And thank you so much for your attention.
Yay, that was awesome.
Okay, cool. Do you want to, for the Q&A, do you want to see other program? Okay. Well, I was giving you.
Right.
We have enough time for the Q&A.
You've given us so much to sort of think through and to,
I'm glad you.
so I wanted to give you a chance to get that started. So I have a few questions I would like to open it up to the rest of the folks. But first of all, it's probably to like
Worked on. I'm thinking there's so many similarities with Voodoo and religion, and Catholicism, and sort of the way that we explain the spirituality of female power. So there's a lot of diaspora relationship to spirituality that I think are really important.
right back to the beginning,
Your terminology,
how you address sort of
this
idea of
gendered power. I was very struck by the very
intentional use of the word
gendered as opposed to female or woman power.
and so I was wondering if you kind of touched on it when you talked about the gender, linkages and power.
So maybe give you a chance to expand a little bit on why you
Use
the terminology
gender power because there's a conceptualization of an Igbo culture.
Understand the binary of masculinism and different things sort of get to the way it was like carefully chosen. I don't think it was just
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Bianca. So the use of gendered was very deliberate. So my first introduction to spirituality in Igbo culture was through Ife Amadume. There's this lady written a lot about female husbands and male wives. And so that was my first introduction. And in many ways in which gender, femininity constructed was mostly through a very specific gendered lens. So she describes how many spiritual deities in Igbo sort of culture have this duality to them, and how gender plays a hugely significant role. It's very different from how it looks in North America. I have to identify because for Igbo culture, particularly when we talk about spirituality, the way gender kind of shows up, it's not just performative. It shows up in it's immensely, how do I describe it? In some practices, you will have men that would transform to the feminine gender, and I use that in air quotes because the way that they would show up in the feminine gender is mostly through their appearance. Sometimes they would change their voice. They would have like a higher voice, but they would do that for that particular ritual. They would do that for that particular purpose, and then they would go about their life being themselves or being their whatever gender they identify as. So in talking about spirituality, you cannot kind of divorce this idea that gender kind of slips in very particular kinds of ways when talking about spirituality. And again, like you said, I touched on the ways in which people are made masculine when they have certain kinds of they're kind of taking up certain kinds of roles in society. Whether you're becoming a queen, you transform into maleness, right? You know, for that particular purpose. It doesn't mean that you go about the world becoming a man, but in that context, you are now seen as masculine in gender, right? So that's why I picked, because I knew I would find, I suspected that I would find this kinds of very nuanced ways in gender.
Amazing. Thank you. I think we have to sort of pass the mic when we ask questions. So I'll ask one more and then I'll end it. So you're gonna have to get that to me.
Sorry, quick question.
Oh, do we
Quick
have
question.
a question?
It's virtual. Hi.
Hi.
I just have a quick question. Do we just put our hands up if we have a question virtually, or do we wait for you guys to pass the mic around? All of you.
You want to do hands up, Rebecca? Yeah, I'll just ask this last one because just connecting, that's a lot of people. Yay. Just continuing on your talk on terminology. And I just want to highlight, I really appreciated the way that you were problematizing the word power and how we conceptualize it and sort of decolonial understanding of what power means. And I just want to highlight that when you were discussing of this idea as blood as power and sort of highlighting how menstruation can act as a potential danger, it struck me as highlighting these different types of power that's not necessarily destructive, but there is a responsibility to having that power. And I just wondered if you wanted to just to speak a little bit more on sort of like this idea that it is not free for all or capitalistic in a way of a constant extraction, but there's a responsibility to the type of power that you're talking about.
Thank you. And I wrote that down. I'm going to put that in my analysis. Absolutely. It's this idea that that you absolutely have to be responsible, that when you're at this time of the month and you have this immense power, that you have to be conscious and conscientious with how you kind of move around in the world. And so we might see that, like I was saying, as not being powerful because you're kind of restricted while you're at this time of the month. But like you said, it means that you're being responsible, you're being mindful of the people around you, and how because you're at this time of the month and you know you have several things happening with you spiritually, because it is seen as spiritual, that you cannot be irresponsible and just sort of just be willy-nilly hanging around and doing whatever, that you do have to be cautious in those times to make sure that you're not causing harm without knowing, and that you completely recognize how powerful you are without being reflected, right? That's kind of, yes, so that's very, very important, absolutely.
Thank you. We can go to, I guess, a Zoom, and then we'll go to in person. So we'll do Zoom because they get neglected, and then we'll continue on here. So Nick Palmer, you have a question, Nick A?
Yes, I do. And I'm sorry if I'm outside, but first of all, I really appreciated your presentation. Very, very, very insightful. And I'm I'm trying to hopefully find my words to frame my question, because a lot of the research that I'm focusing on is mental health treatments and our understanding of mental illness within Jamaica and the historical roots of that. And through my research, I've kind of seen similarities in terms of what you speak of in terms of fluidity, or I would say maybe a hybridization of what we in Haiti they would refer to it as voodoo, but in Jamaica we refer to it as obia. And so what I'm kind of asking is, my research kind of looks at the ways in which that breaking from our spirituality, breaking from culture, traditions, and whatnot, the psychological effect of that, and the continuing trauma of that And so my question is in terms of spirituality and religion, can they be tools or vehicles in order to heal the diaspora on a larger scale? I'm sorry, that may be very general, but that's kind of the things that I'm thinking about as you did your presentation.
Thanks, okay. I'm going to ask the question that you asked. I want to make sure that I got it. Are you saying, was the question, were you kind of asking in what way was religion used to steal? I heard the word steal. In what ways? Heal. Oh, heal. In what ways is spirituality used to heal? Is that it?
Yeah, so within Jamaican culture and how we view Christianity, there is a strict hybridization between Christianity and Obia. So I'm from a very rural part of Jamaica. So some of those African traditions, they seem to have held on very strongly. And the ways that you were talking about religion and spirituality actually sent chills down to my spine because I saw so many connections between that. But I feel like with the legacy of slavery, there's been that separation or for lack of a better word, kind of castration from our spirituality, pre-colonial kind of Africa. So I'm wondering, as a way to move forward as a collective in order to really truly heal some of the traumas associated with slavery, is reconnecting to that pre-colonial spirituality a method, or is that possible?
Yes, thank you, Nikki. Yes, I completely understand your question now. So the easy question I would say would be yes. I believe that it can be done. I believe that those connections are happening in many pockets of Nigeria in particular. So it can absolutely be done in other locations. But before I go ahead and answer your question more directly, I do have to kind of identify that many conversations and discourses about decolonization kind of prioritize the need to kind of decolonize education, decolonize intellect, and which is wonderful. It's amazing. I absolutely agree. However, I've always found that if we end those conversations with just decolonizing education, that it's not enough. That there's a reason why, for example, that it's not enough that you go to school and hear that, that your ancestors were intelligent and they were brilliant and they were lovely and they were theorizing and it's not enough. And then the gods of your ancestors are portrayed in a very negative, barbaric light. Like it's just not. It can cause a huge sense of dissonance, right? So, so, so to answer your question, Nikki, I absolutely believe that it can be done. I believe that it's incredibly essential for us to do that work if we're looking to heal, if we're looking to have those deeper conversations about what does it mean to kind of recover from colonial trauma. We cannot be talking about, recovering from colonial trauma if we're not really addressing sort of the devastating effects that religion was used, particularly as a tool. It is, it is what it is. It was used as a tool. It is still being used as a tool. It's an incredibly effective tool, and that is the truth. And so those conversations have to happen. I do have to mention that in trying to reclaim our spirituality, that it is a very difficult journey, and there's a lot of co-opting going on, and we do have to be mindful about how spirituality continues to be co-opted for all kinds of different means, and it's very complicated, but it absolutely should be done and can be done.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your response and your presentation overall. You rock.
Okay. I'm so honored. Okay. Hi, my name is Harriet, and I'm from the philosophy department. It is really my honor and pleasure to listen to Effie about this lecture, about this presentation, and agreeing with much of your presentation. And I really like it, like the idea. I do have a question, maybe kind of harsh question to ask as a cultural outsider of yours, and because I'm like feminism philosophy is also my field. And so regarding the female-centered religions and spiritualities in the world, there's a thing that like female-centered religious spirituality doesn't really protects the woman's rights and the worldly power of women, like historically, like in case of the South Asian the Shaktism, like even though like the female gods are like worshipped as the center of the universe, but the real living condition of women in South India not very good. And also same thing with like Japan, like the supreme god is a sun god and a female. But the condition of women living there, 7도网络以内, yeah, very not very good. And also same thing with like the modern time, like when we come up with the godness of the law, the justice, or the godness whatever, like it's called the so-called neoclassical time when people are trying to revive the Greek godnesses. It's like there's a very like a so deep-rooted tendency of in patriarchy that either make woman divine, deification and objectification of woman. So makes the woman either divine or some object of desire, but never woman in themselves. Like so to protect woman's real rights and worldly powers. So, but I do appreciate, but to be honest, I really appreciate your lecture. As I think this like challenging the spirituality shaped by Christianity, like colonialism and capitalism is I think it's a very important approach. And so my question would be like, following your approach and your tradition, like using the power of spirituality, how it is possible to contribute to the advancement of like current, like all the like the feminism agenda and the living of personal life of women in real life, basically like the abolishment of patriarchy, both in personal life and as a social world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for bringing that perspective from your own location. So your question requires a very long answer. There is no easy answer, and it's really is quite a challenge. The question that you asked about how to dismantle patriarchy, it's ongoing. We'll continue to do that work. So that's for that point. The ways in which the idea of power, the conceptualizations of power in my location, how this could be used and help people in the future, is predominantly most of the work that I do. We have to change this idea of what it means to be powerful. There has to be a huge acknowledgement that the idea that African women need to be empowered in a very particular kind of way that insists that it must be done along the lines of the UN sustainable development, blah, blah, blah. We have to divorce ourselves from those kinds of attachments because it just doesn't, it's like a round peg in a square hole. No, that's wrong. The opposite. It doesn't work. There are different ways in which one can be powerful. And so there has to be that emphasis on acknowledging different types of power, celebrating different kinds of power, insisting that to be powerful in different location might look different because every culture is different, the history is different, the history of colonization is different, all of that is different. And so there must be an understanding, a recognition that what it means to be a powerful African woman, and that's so contentious, and I know that, it means it's different things. It's different things in different locations. That's the easy cop-out answer for you. I do have to bring in a little bit of context about sort of the effect of Christianity, because that's my focus. The effect of Christianity and how that kind of altered the status of Igbo women. In no way does my work kind of romanticize Igbo culture or the history and say that there was no patriarchy and it was all kumbaya and men and women were kind of, it was wonderful. It doesn't do that. My work, and that's why it's critical, insists that there was absolutely patriarchy, but it was a different, I think Ify Amajime describes it as a different type of patriarchy. There is another author from Latin America that describes the patriarchy that was introduced through colonization as low intensity patriarchy, literally. What's her name? Segato describes it as low intensity, that before colonization, it was low intensity patriarchy. And with colonization, it became high intensity patriarchy. And and the argument that she makes is that before colonization, there was no, it wasn't like there was no contention between men and women. It existed, but they weren't fighting for resources in the way that they're fighting for resources now. There wasn't this idea, there wasn't this scarcity mentality where we have to climb, we have to, we've got to be, we got to pull everybody down. It didn't exist in the way that it exists today. And the other ways in which it became a high intensity patriarchy was with colonization, there was this elevation of the masculine status. Men became a lot more important, right? It became a lot more important because the colonizers were using the men as their tools, whatever it is, to conquer. And so they gained a new kind of status that they didn't have before. So that overimportance also kind of reflected in the way in the way they kind of moved around the world, in the interaction that they had with women. There was also this divide between the public sphere and the private sphere. And that also meant that women were now domesticated and were seen as belonging in the private sphere, and the men are now in the public domain. And that also kind of caused friction in gender relations. And so that also contributes to this high intensity patriarchy. There are other ways in which Segato describes how, this switch between low intensity and high intensity, but at no time is the argument that there was no patriarchy. That's just untrue. There absolutely has always been patriarchy, but it took on an entirely new meaning with the introduction of Christianity. And I do have to point out that in Igbo cosmology, there are a multitude of deities. You don't have just this one god. There are a multitude, and some of these deities and gods are female, right? So there wasn't this insistence on a single male god. And so it wasn't odd to have women in authority because you have gods that, and I know it's different in your location because you also touched on that, the god, the gender. So because there was this insistence on the single male god did not exist, and now things changed and there now became a single male god, how that also reflected in gender relations being incredibly contentious, right? So they all kind of feed into, it's a lot. It's all there, it's all kind of feeds into how patriarchy changed completely. You see, you have another question. Okay.
A quick follow-up, because we have two
Right.
more people that have
Okay.
questions.
Okay, good. Like I just needed 20 seconds to like defend for Christianity a little bit, not because I'm Christianity, but it's like Christianity, like back in the time, was a critical response to like a Rome Empire and radical revolution in like Jewish, like the earlier like Abraham like religion. At least like I always feels like the like Christianity is like Jesus during the time may had made a thesis that there is no father love in a patriarchy of father authority society. It's like so. It's like, but what happened later becomes like so that's why he was killed and chased away. But later, so you could see Christianity as somehow as revolutionary, rebellious, and reformative. But later, it's like we all know that Christianity become like utilized and integrated into Rome Empire, the patriarchy itself, and things later become tool of colonization, which is very hypocritical. So it's like I think there's also a lot of there. I will be very happy to talk with you like later.
Absolutely.
I thought, okay, we'll go with Keisha
And then, okay,
maybe we'll take a few questions, and then you'll answer all of them,
Okay.
like take a.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Keisha. So my question is actually, it follows your question a little bit, in the sense that, so, you talked about the female nakedness of the mother is seen as powerful, and you're talking about this dualistic fluidity. But within Christianity, there was a lot of, there's this misogyny built into Christianity because even I remember reading something a while ago about how even the whole idea of the serpent representing female power and having to be demonized within Christianity, and this kind of erasure of female power within Christianity. So now, and then you have the female body, the naked body within Christianity, being evil and whatever. So now you have you have these queens who are like, no, I'm naked and I'm powerful, but are they also practicing Christianity? And how do they reconcile the celebration of the body? Because even within Christianity and the whole idea of if you menstruate, you have to go out in the bush for a week and whatever, which may sync up with what you were saying, but it was more of a perspective of being unclean. It wasn't a perspective of being powerful. So I'm just curious how people who are practicing both kind of reconcile these two things. I'm sorry, I'm hating a bit on.
No, it's okay. So take notes and then we'll go to the second question.
New Testament, New Old Testament.
Oh, yes, right.
All right. Good. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. I postponed my death to be here to listen to you. I would love for you to speak to the fact that spirituality could take on a very personal, individualistic nature, and how does that actually combine itself or find its root in the collective, taking the African perspective into account. I would love for you to also speak to the fact that when we talk about power, it can be like the Queen's mother, it can be located in a person or in the structure, but what about those relational connections where power is actually located? How do we actually see power evolving both at the structural level and the personal level? And is this power, and can you talk to, I think I'm going too long, and can you speak to how the sociotherapy, I'm going in for nonsense, how does spirituality in the African tradition really speak to protect this, speak to be a sociotherapeutic answer to the Africans? Because that's something that's deeply connected to the African tradition, and I'm putting that concept out of Fanon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ife. I think for me, one of the interesting part is around fertility.
Yes.
And, from your research, what are some of the contentions around the idea of fertility and the power that women embody because of their fertility? And given, like, for example, the example you were giving of how, the use of Western medicine is sort of like, downplaying the power that women have in procreating, and that fertility is spiritual. What are some of the ways in which within the context you're looking at, people are able to reconcile how fertility is spiritual, whereas Western medicine treats it as a biomedical condition? Especially, we can talk more, but I did find it as well in this other research I did on maternal health, on the contradictions between Western medicine and African beliefs on fertility, childbirth, pregnancy. So how does your context reconcile those contradictions between the two world realms?
I think we only have time for those three. Unless, okay, I feel bad. Everybody.
Hello. Yeah. Mine is a quick question, actually. So I noticed that you focused on the Igbo tribe. So I was wondering if, like, you studied any other tribes, and if Igbo maybe follows something that other tribes in Africa are doing or practicing. That's it. Yeah, I'll keep it.
All right, so we have 4 questions that if he's going to answer in 1 minute, no. Take your time.
Okay, I'm going to answer the easiest question first, which is the last question. So I only focused on the Igbo community because it's my community, and they say charity begins at home. So I thought I'm going to start with my community. But while I was having these discussions and doing field work, I was thinking of many ways in which many of the research that I do could also be replicated in West Africa. like I haven't gone to any other place in West Africa, but I can only imagine that this idea of just dualistic fluidity will also be something quite similar in many other pockets of particularly West Africa. Right? Across, thank you, Ruth. Across, right.
I connect.
Right, so you always have to start from home. So I thought starting from home would be the best way to kind of to start doing this research. So that is the easiest question. So thank you for the easy question. Now I'm going to respond to Ruth. So this idea of fertility, you asked the question about how do they reconcile this and what does that look like? I think in many ways we have to recognize just how much erasure colonization sort of creates. Because for many people that might be going through fertility complications, the goal is to, first of all, kind of seek medical Western treatment first. Like that's the first thing you do. You go and do a scan, you go and check what you check your blood and see what that looks like. And when they have had many disappointing, encounters with the medical kind of Western, there's always this, maybe we should try something else type of thing. Maybe we should go and speak to such and such a person. Maybe we should go and speak to this lady down the road that may have some lotions and potions for us to kind of try. So that's kind of, I don't know if that's a way to reconcile that, but that's kind of how it happens, where there is this dualistic fluidity, right? Where even some people, while they're talking to their fertility doctors, they're drinking a bunch of lotions and potions, and they're just waiting to see which one will kind of click. That's kind of how they reconcile that, right? Regardless of how educated or how whatever, there will always be that family member still trying to tell you, have you tried this? Have you spoken to that person? That's just how it is, right? And even with people that have all this education and have all this, and they're Western in their thinking and whatever, they're never completely, they would never completely dismiss that, like connection with, okay, I'm just going to try something just in case. Maybe it's something that's responsible. Maybe there's something spiritual about the fact that I can have a baby. Yeah, that's the answer that's kind of how it's reconciled. It's still that, push and pull between how much medical Western medicine should I use and how much should I go back to my roots and try and figure out a way to resolve this problem that I have. Hopefully I've answered your question, and we can talk about this, Ruth. Kelston. Oh, Kelston. Oh my God.
Ignorance.
Sorry. Sounded so bad.
The echo.
She's not even.
That's public.
I'm here, like, hello. Yes, it is. Yes. Regs, oh dear. Okay, Kelston, I will do my very best to answer your question. Because there's a lot to your question, but I'm going to sort of pick on a particular point that you made about therapy.
Of your after.
Oh yes, absolutely. I'm going to sort of focus on the part of your question that talks about the therapeutic sort of element. In some of my conversations with my co-producers, they were able to kind of identify the ways in which, for example, widowhood rights in the past were done in a very particular way to kind of help the widow to recover, to kind of help her, and many of those ways were, again, completely spiritual. Things like not seeing the body of your husband that has passed away, because you can have immense trauma by just being in the same room or seeing the body of a loved one that has passed away, and other things like chanting and singing that is done, giving you the space to cry, giving you the space to mourn in different kinds of ways, especially through the singing and through the chanting, and how that was ways that really identified that it was important that women, widows in particular, had that time to kind of mourn the departure of their husbands, was incredibly important in the ways, it was incredibly therapeutic. I do have to say that many of those things have been co-opted. I would be remiss not to say that. But that was the intent. The intent was to always prioritize the health and well-being of the widow. And I speak on the widowhood rights in particular. There were other things that were kind of done, thinking about therapeutic, like, okay, for example, there are several trees and herbs that were identified as being incredibly therapeutic, just sitting under a certain tree. There's this tree called Udala tree, just sitting under the Udala tree. I don't know the English name, I'm sure it has a name, but sitting under the Udala tree had many therapeutic qualities for people. You would sit under that tree, and there was a belief that under the Udala tree that there were certain spirits that would provide you with peace and calmness. That tree also brought about fertility. And so just being in nature, right? Like, I don't know who does nature to the Africans. I don't care what you have to say. But just being under that tree and being in nature was a way to was immensely therapeutic. And when you sat under this tree, you were not supposed to speak harshly. You were not supposed to make noise. You were just supposed to kind of sit there and just be by yourself, just be in yourself. So those are some of the ways in which, the spirituality that we have absolutely lost, really prioritize the well-being and sort of therapeutic needs of its people. And we can talk about the other things that you talk about, because you talk about a lot.
Keisha, you talked about reconciling
this. Oh man. I don't want to sound dismissive, but I think the ways in which Igbo women reconcile both is by picking and choosing.
Sorry, can I just clarify? I mean specifically with the body, because that's my right, because Christianity is like hate your body, and women are like, we love our, that's
it is still, there is still some form of picking and choosing, because many of these women, although they identify as traditionalist, they pray in the name of Jesus. That's just another thing that I have to absolutely say. It doesn't answer your question, I apologize. But in visiting some of these, one particular Omu that is hugely traditionalist, there was a crucifix in her living room. And I kept staring at the crucifix, but wondering if I should ask, but I absolutely did not. But it made sense. That's kind of, so it's picking and choosing. So while they're practicing their traditional spirituality, they have this love and respect, and they're powerful in their nakedness. And then when they do have to be in that kind of Christian spaces, it's different, right? And it makes perfect sense to them. And I really battled with this, I'm really at it being genuine at it, but it made sense to them. And it kept on coming up quite a lot in my interviews with completely different people in different places, that I couldn't dismiss it. And I couldn't look at it like, oh, it's just people just wanting to sound a certain way. That is exactly how they live their lives. It makes sense to them. The fact that I went to, I went on field work and I didn't expect to see that doesn't make it any less valid. Yeah.
Y'all already you doing what you're supposed to do. But yes, thank you, Ife. That was a wonderful presentation. It kept people wanting to discuss it more, meaning that it's definitely been a lot of fruit for thought. And this was our first Tubman talk. So thank you so much, Ife. Thank you to everybody who is here in person. Thank you to everybody on the Zoom. And we will see you next week for, oh shoot, I'm not ready. For, good thing this is a traveling, for Dr. New Wakolo with his Tubman talk. I murdered. I'm so sorry. It's somebody help me. No color. There we go. So the talk will be human rights and the growing informal security industry in Africa. And I suggest one day we have a diaspora linguistic workshop where folks from the French, British, Caribbean learn to pronounce the names properly of our African veterans and sistrans. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.